This is just simply not the budget that I've been advocating for.
This is a brutal austerity budget.
So I will be voting no on this final budget.
So remember that time that council members Nelson, Sawant, and Peterson all voted the same way? Okay, well, neither do I, but welcome to the world of the 2022 Seattle City Council budget. We're going to talk about those 3 no votes at the budget committee level, as well as these 6 yeses. What are the major cuts and major adds to this budget? Plus, how will King County implement a program for walk-in mental health crisis clinics? And what's the newest trend with COVID that has doctors so concerned? Well, we've got all this and more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And joining me is my co-host, Kevin Schofield, bon vivant and weekly columnist for the South Seattle Emerald. Kevin, I saw your recent tweet about wrapping up the outdoor pipes with the temperatures going below freezing in Seattle. Not your traditional holiday greeting, but a pretty important one. There's some snow falling right now outside my place.
Yeah, this is super, super important. And, a bunch of us a couple of years ago, when you had that hard freeze,
Yeah.
The hard way, if you don't wrap your pipes in spigots, you're going to get broken pipes. And I mean, it's good if you're a plumber, it's good business. But for the rest of us, that's the last thing you want on a cold winter morning. So get out there and just wrap those pipes and protect them, and you will thank yourself later.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. John, keep on cranking out the quality foam there on the first floor of City Hall. And if you're listening, please do become a patron of the show. At the $10 level, you get a special edition Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug sent to you, and your mugshot will be featured on the program. Last chance to dance on this, folks. I think we're going to come up with some all-new promotional material in 2023, but we have a couple left here. This week's mugshot of the week, some holiday cheer from Karen. Karen, thank you so much for sending that, for your continued support. Really appreciated. And also an update from Converge Media here. The Washington State Homeowner Assistance Fund, the HAF, is ready to help you. If you have fallen behind on house payments because of some issues related to COVID, well, that's where the HAF can help out. If you qualify, you can get up to $60,000. So connect with the HAF counselors. They are ready to get you through the holidays. Give the hotline a call, 877-894-4663, or visit washingtonhaf.org. Okay, time for Right Here, Right Now. Okay, so Kevin, the budget the Seattle City Council is finally approving this week after about a week's delay. It did the job because it's pretty clear nobody's happy. That's when you know you had a good process, when nobody's happy about it. So I want to break down kind of who got what and where this landed. And let's start with public safety and police, please. The mayor had this plan to put parking enforcement officers back in the Seattle Police Department where they started, not in the Department of Transportation, where there's been a ton of problems going on. He got that after some pushback from the council. So that's one piece of this. But, and this is what council members Nelson and Peterson didn't like, 80 positions in the SPD have been abrogated. An important word to understand. Let's talk about public safety and police to start here, please.
Yeah, so abrogation is this funny thing where a department like SPD, who is way below kind of being fully hired, can have these positions, and they automatically get budget for salary for those positions,
right?
Even if there's no chance based on their hiring plan they can actually fill those positions this year,
right?
But that gives them essentially extra money in the budget they can they can use for other things like overtime and things like that. So they really wanted to keep those positions in the budget. And there's also sort of this symbolic thing of, is by some people who are very pro-police who've been arguing that sort of abrogating these positions kind of reframes the optimal size of the police, with the city council saying, no, we're putting a new ceiling on how big we're going to allow police to get, because they'll never politically be able to go back and add in more positions at a future time, given their progressive left base in the positions that they're taking on this. So, a win for the progressive left and a loss for the mayor was that the city council did in fact abrogate a lot of those positions. And partly that was certainly because it was a super tough budget year with extra revenue losses, and they wanted that money to be able to go spend it on other things.
Right.
But that at the same time, they also made some cuts to recruiting and retention programs for SPD, kind of a few other things. So there were a bunch of cuts, and one big cut, again, this abrogating positions to SPD's budget.
Basically, they have to ask, the SPD would have to ask for those positions back in a future budget to put them back on, basically. I wanted to make sure I made that clear.
Yep. And
Right.
they have less money to repurpose for other things over the course of the year.
Right, like
Right.
overtime, et cetera. And
So
can you talk about that parking enforcement officer piece real quick?
yeah, parking enforcement officers were an SPD for the longest time as part of this move to civilianize as much, and they are essentially civilian. They're not sworn officers. They don't
Right.
carry a gun or anything like that. They can't arrest you for other offenses. Um, to sort of the city council has been on this push to sort of take all the extraneous civilian stuff out of SPD and leave the core of SPD being, the sworn officers.
Hmm.
So they moved the parking enforcement officers out. And you may remember we had a year ago this big debate about whether they should go to SDOT or whether they
Right.
should go to the new CSCC.
Yeah, the communications
And
center. Hmm.
they ended up putting them in SDOT, and
Yeah.
that's there was a disagreement between the frontline parking enforcement officers and their management. Their management said we'd kind of rather go to the CSCC, but
Right.
the PO said, "Hey, SDOT seems like it would be a great place to work, so we want to go
Yeah.
there instead." And
Yeah.
SDOT said, "Bring them on over. We'd love to have them."
Yeah,
And it turned
right.
out SDOT really wasn't ready, and they made a bunch of mistakes, and the overhead costs for having SDOT were super high.
Yeah.
And so Mayor Harrell's come back and said, "Okay, we have to figure out some things. Not sure, I'm okay long term with not having them in SPD, but
Potentially,
for the
right.
short term, this isn't working. So let's move them back in, park them back in SPD, pardon the pun,
Yeah.
while we go figure out where the long term solution is really going to be."
Okay. Okay.
And some of the city council members said, maybe we should just leave them in SDOT and try to make that work.
Hmm.
Because if you move back in SPD, we might never get them out of SPD again.
Right.
If,
Right.
if the political winds shift.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, the mayor won out over this, and they are now going to be back in SPD again, at least
Right.
for the short term.
Right. All right. Let me switch gears to human services with you here, Kevin. So the mayor trying to expand his unified care team. This is a group that works with people who are homeless, tries to get them into services. Some people have called it a direct reflection of the navigation team that was relatively unpopular a few years ago with the Durkin administration. Council pushed back on that and pushed back on the mayor's plan to cut cost of inflation raises for human services workers. What's the breakdown here when it comes to human services?
Yeah, so the unified care team is the mayor's big push, and certainly one could argue that this is kind of a regeneration of the navigation team.
Yeah.
One twist that he's put on it is he really wants to have dedicated people for each area of the city, so
Right.
that it isn't one team that, depending on whatever the hotspot is, everybody goes and converges there. That they
Right.
can really make sure that there are people in each neighborhood in each region of the city. Think of it
Yes. Right.
approximately like the sort of police precincts.
Yes. Right.
Uh, who can go do outreach to homeless encampments and participate on the day of when camps are being cleaned, when they're
Right.
being removed.
Getting moved.
To
Yeah.
make sure there's outreach there, and doing that would expand the size of the team.
Mhm.
And what the city council has said is, no, we don't want to increase more outreach on this team, and we probably
Right.
don't want to increase the size of the team altogether. This is why you have a regional homeless authority for King
Right.
County. They should do outreach. So we're going to take the money that the mayor wanted to go towards hiring more people for the unified care team,
Right.
and we're going to increase the outreach budget for the regional homeless authority.
Hmm.
Now the twist here, and we're going to have to see how this plays out, is the
Yeah.
regional homeless authority has not wanted to do outreach on the day of homeless encampment
That's right.
removals,
Mhm.
and that's sort of how the city got back into the business of doing it itself.
Yeah, because
Right.
someone's got to be there. Right.
So
Mhm.
we certainly want somebody to be there on
Yeah.
the day of, even if there's weeks and weeks of outreach leading up to the day of encampment removal.
Right.
We just don't want to
Right.
abandon the people that day. So will
Right.
the RHA suddenly be willing to do it on day of?
Yeah.
I think there's a good chance that they won't.
Yeah.
So then
Yeah.
will it just not happen because the city council has taken that money away from the unified care team?
Yeah. Wow. That's a good question. And I want to go into this whole question of human services workers and the cost of living, or excuse me, the cost of inflation raises they're going to get, because this was a bit of a political football too. And I think it leads into this larger question of funding for the city's budget in the long term. But the council went with this. They wanted to give those cost of inflation raises to those human services workers. It's something that Mayor Harrell was in support of when he was a council member back in 2019. He said, we need these raises in good times and in bad. his budget didn't reflect that as mayor, but this is something that the council pushed for successfully. But it really does get into this larger issue of the budget hole that we're looking at this year and years ahead too. Can you touch on this issue real quick with human services workers?
Yeah. So it's a really, really important issue because without cost inflation increases, which is how the city ran for human services contract for the longest time,
Yeah.
pay for workers at all these NGOs that doing human services work that the city was contracting with was just getting worse and worse and worse.
Right.
And then every time they came up for rebidding these, because oftentimes the bids for these contracts go to lowest bidder, it was kind of a race to the bottom. Right. Which of these NGOs could get in the lowest bid where they were paying the workers the least and still get the contract? So the city came to and said, no, there has to be cost of living increases each year. And, for the longest time, inflation was kind of stuck around 2%, 2%, maybe 2.5 to 3, maybe down to 1.5, but generally around 2%. And then just last year, we've had a crazy bump up in inflation, right, to really high levels. So what the mayor did in his budget was saying that there's no way, what he said was there's no way we can afford to do the full, 8.5%, 9% increase.
Right. He was saying more like 4%. Yeah.
So he said, I want to smooth it over a bunch of years. So we'll do 4% for 2023.
Yeah.
We'll probably end up doing another 4% kind of in the following year.
Sure.
And the city council said, no. That's nice for us, but it doesn't help the workers, right?
Yeah.
Because they really did see a bump of 8.5 to 9% of cost of living increases this year.
Yeah.
So we're going to help them out. So the city council took money from other things and plugged it in there to give the full, not just 4%, but the full COLA increase to human services workers.
Got it. But that really leads into this larger discussion about what the city's going to be doing with its budget into the future, because this is, we're working with a deficit here this year, and the council's been able to get through that with the payroll tax money. But looking ahead, it doesn't seem completely tenable. You mentioned to me in an email, it seems like it's kicking the can down the road. And is that how you would typify what's happening here?
Well, so there's two sides of this. One is, what's going on with expenses and inflation. Most people are expecting in 2024, probably even, well before the end of 2023, is going to be back to sort of historical levels, right?
Lower.
2% plus or minus a little bit a year, right?
Yeah.
So nobody's really expecting we're going to have high inflation for a long period of time.
Right.
But the revenue side is the problem.
Yeah.
Right. And, this year they patched a bunch of holes with the payroll tax.
Yeah.
But, there's sort of a limit to how much they can do that unless they actually sort of want to increase the payroll tax some more.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And in the meantime, there's some other sources of revenues, and the hope is the usual general fund sources of revenues, and the other big thing that came in low this year, which is real estate excise tax, will bounce back to normal levels. But nobody really knows how long that's going to take.
Right.
At this point, as our economic recovery continues to just kind of creep along back up again. Right. So the city council patched some revenue holes largely with payroll tax money this year that was supposed to go to other things, largely housing.
Yeah.
And they didn't really solve the problem for 2024 or 2025 and beyond. So they have this progressive revenue task force that's supposed to come back mid next year with some recommendations on other revenue sources. We'll see what they come back with. They're not going to have a lot of choices.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Very interesting. I did want to touch on one budget piece here, Kevin, that I'm really interested in. You and I have talked about this before, but this idea the council is now calling it a dual dispatch program, an alternative to 911, where mental health workers would join police officers in the field to deal with these low acuity calls, wellness checks, things of this nature. This is something the mayor and council agreed on earlier this fall. They came to this fairly rare term sheet type of agreement, but we're going through this process right now, and it's in the budget. So we're going to see some sort of pilot program online in early 2023. I guess I'm looking at this now with the knowledge that the council is abrogating unfilled positions in the SPD. We're in year 2 of the Seattle Police Officers Guild not having a contract. I'm just wondering what it's going to be like for this 911 alternative system to get off the ground. What do you think?
Yeah. So, one of the conversations we've been having for over a year is How do we offload from SPD, particularly given the staffing crisis that they're in, some things where we really
Right.
don't need a police officer to show up?
Yep.
And uh, it sort of breaks down into 4 categories that they'd like to be able to assign, have 911 callers sort of dispatch.
Yep.
Ones where we say, nope, we can send a mental health worker out to it,
Yep. Only.
or
Yeah.
some other civilian, person to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe mobile one or health one or something like that.
Sure. Right.
We there's a second category where we send out an SPD officer and one of these civilian workers, but the civilian worker is in the
Mhm.
lead, and the police officer is kind of in a backup position.
Right.
The third is we send out the pair, but the police officer is in the lead, right, and the
Yep.
mental health worker is in a backup position. And the fourth is we just send a police officer.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
hard question around this has been, can 911 dispatchers figure out, based on the limited information they have when somebody calls in,
Yeah.
which of the right ones of those 4 to categorize this in, and
Right.
what's the worst case scenario if they're wrong,
Mm.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
So what they agreed upon last summer, looking at this, SPD and
Mhm.
the council and other city officials, was that there is actually some set of that first category where we just can send sort of a civilian out that we can identify. So there's some we can do. We can work on the right way to sort of plug in somebody or 911 system to do that, and then we can start to also pick off some of these where we say, all right, these are cases where we can send the dual set out.
Dual
So
dispatch.
there were
Yeah.
just
Mhm.
so there were some kind of low hanging fruit where it really wasn't a hard call at all.
Right.
911 dispatchers basically have enough information to do that. So they're picking off
Yeah.
some of those and they're trying to set up something to be able to just get that going right now. And if it
Yeah.
works, it'll actually help SPD, right? It will
Yeah.
offload
Yeah.
some work from SPD, which will
Yeah.
allow police officers to do more of what we really sort of need police officers and only police officers doing.
Right, right. I'm very much looking forward to that. I know Councilmember Andrew Lewis has been pushing for this for some time. A lot of council members have, and I think of all different sides of the spectrum politically, they're really looking for some new answers here. So very interested to see how that all is going to break down. So a lot more on that ahead, and I tell you what else, we got a lot more on the show here. Some important work for the King County Council on the docket next week, creating a new system of walk-in mental health clinics. How's that going to work? Where are these clinics going to go? We got the details on. Now hear this. Okay, well, something to watch on the King County Council docket this next week, folks. Councilmember Gurmai Zahalai will be laying out the framework of a plan to build a system of crisis care centers all around the county for mental and behavioral health care. Here's part of that plan and the plan of where these facilities should go, as explained on King County TV.
Proposing 5 different locations, one in South King County, one in North King County, one in East King County, one in Seattle, and one youth-focused one. A network of crisis care centers where people can voluntarily walk in, or a first responder can bring somebody, and they go into a place that is therapeutic, where they can get the care and the treatment they need to heal.
Well, Kevin, this was something we heard about earlier in the fall. It looks like it's going to be a property tax ballot measure on the April 2023 ballot. So now that the November elections are over and the budget process is done, it's definitely campaigning time for a lot of these things. So it looks like it'll be about $121 per year for the average homeowner, an 8-year levy starting in 2024. I guess I just wanted your overall take on this plan, Kevin. There's clearly a need here for this type of service. What do you think about this?
Bravo. So
Yeah.
King County in this, we have this joint Seattle King County Public Health Department that is funded by both of them, and both, the city has some responsibilities for what it needs to fund, and the county has some responsibilities. In the split, the county has been responsible for mental health treatment services, and quite frankly, they've dropped the ball for years and years and years on this. They have not funded it. We've heard some things just in the last few months from King County Executive Dow Constantine saying that they're investing some more money so they can basically shore up what they have right now and keep it running. But it is so far less than what we actually need. And this is a case where, there's been nothing for crisis centers, no mental health crisis centers in King County at all, which is not.
It's not tenable.
It's just not tenable. So having 5 centers spread across the county and one that's particularly youth focused, I think is going to be, I
Mhm.
hope, a huge improvement. We'll see, we'll see what hurdles they have to jump over to get there. One of the big problems in
Yeah.
this whole area is just a lack of staff, right? There are not enough people
Yeah.
out there nationwide
That's
to
a
do
great
this
point.
kind of work. So it
Yeah.
may be that the limit for how quickly they can get these places open is just finding the people who can run them. We'll see.
That's a big piece. And I also wanted to talk about citing these, which is always problematic with different social service agencies. The Seattle Times had a piece a few weeks ago about a state care facility that will be going into the Stanwood area up in Snohomish County. Some significant pushback from neighbors there. It's just this whole idea of deinstitutionalizing mental health care. It used to be send them to Western or something like that when there was an issue. Now what's happening at the state level, and I think at the county level too, is this realization that we're trying to put these different centers into neighborhoods where people are so they can actually go to those centers. It sounds good, but it's not always easy when it comes to citing these facilities. Some thoughts on that, Kevin?
Yeah, and we need to make sure we don't throw these facilities all into sort of one bucket.
Okay.
There are a bunch of them. Deinstitutionalizing was saying, okay, these places don't all have to be residential, right? There's a
Right.
lot
Okay.
of these kinds of services we can provide that are outpatient, right?
Right.
In that
Right.
case, it really helps to have them in places near where the people are who are going to need them, right? But crisis centers
Mhm.
are almost certainly going to be residential, right? Well, this is a place where people can check in.
Mhm.
They're a
Mhm.
danger to themselves or maybe a danger to the community, and they are going to need 24-hour supervision. They're going to need to be in a place at least for a short period of time where they can be watched around the clock, right? So, there's always going to be some level of institutions around this, right? And institutionalizing
Yeah, that's
people,
true. Yeah.
particularly in crisis situations, those can be harder places to cite. I think
Mhm.
this is a case where, particularly with the kind of outpatient facilities, where their communities sometimes worry, like, if you place one of these here, are you attracting people into our community that we're not
Right.
going to want
Right.
to be there?
Mhm. Yeah.
If you take a good hard look at it, it's almost always true that the people are already there, right? You're
Yeah.
just not.
Right.
We're either not
Right.
seeing them or they're not coming out in public. Right. So it's not that we're
Right.
drawing
Right.
them to them. It's like, "You guys, they're already there. Let's serve the people who are there with these things." But
Yeah.
I
Face the
mean, it will be
reality
a
of it.
challenge. We can look at things like Chinatown International District and the struggles that they've
Right.
had, right? And
Mhm.
in part, um, one side of the story is that's where the people are who need a lot of these kinds of behavioral health
Mhm.
services, because of the nearby homeless populations.
Mhm.
But another flip side of this is that tends to be a community that historically has not been consulted enough, and has not had the
Right.
political capital to prevent things from going into its neighborhood that it wouldn't necessarily want, though, or to force the city to consult with them first,
Right.
right? So, I
Yep.
think
Yep.
we're going to see, another round of that here, right? Somebody's going to suggest
Yep.
one of these centers should go in the CID, and hopefully this time they'll
Sure.
consult with the
Right.
community first, right? Rather
Yeah.
than just
Yeah.
dropping it in there.
Yeah. Right. That county shelter plan is certainly an example of that. I wanted to touch on one more health issue with you here, Kevin, and if we could, because I want to make sure we get to our pod jam coming up. We talked about the flu rates on the show recently. Please, needed people. There's a big thing right now and around the state with COVID. Yeah, remember that pandemic? It's turned into a very challenging discussion about the amount of people, especially older people, dying every day from this disease. The CDC, I should say, is saying this: more than 300 people are still dying each day, on average, from COVID-19 in our country. Most of them 65 or older, which is a lot lower than that daily total of 2,000 that we saw at the peak of the Delta wave not too long ago. But still, about 2 to 3 times the rate at which people die of the flu. So we start talking about this acceptable loss. And I'm putting big, big air quotes around that, Kevin, because I know we all want to be back to normal, but who's paying for it? This is a really tough discussion.
This is a super tough discussion, and it really is, again, a sign of the politicization of everything these days. We've had the tools for over a year to reduce COVID deaths to nearly zero, right? And we have the best resources of any nation in the world to do that. And it's not that
Mhm.
we've tried and failed. It's we've simply mostly chosen not to try, right? We have not really, gotten together as large communities as a nation in vaccinating everybody, right? And getting everybody boosters.
Yeah.
The booster uptakes, again, even though we have the best now updated boosters of any country in the world, the uptake has been terrible for them, right? So, pandemics run their course, but they don't disappear overnight. So, this one seems to be on slow simmer. And the mortality rate is way down, and partly because we have vaccinations, which is reducing some amount of, it moving through the community, but also because we have really good treatments. But the mortality rate is way down, but it's disproportionately affecting the elderly, the poor, and the already sick. So then the question is, as you said, with this notion of, what's acceptable here, are we as a society okay with that?
Yeah.
And what it really shows here is that we don't have a public health system in the United States. We have no permanent infrastructure for deploying public health interventions like vaccines. We rely very heavily on the privatized part of our health care system in this country, which is largely dysfunctional, right? And it certainly disproportionately favors people with a bunch of money, right? So we have no long-term relationship between the public health infrastructure that we do have in most of the country, because we focus so long on prioritizing privatized healthcare. So imagine if we had Medicare for all, right? Everybody has a doctor that they know and trust and will take medical advice from. We could use that to get vaccines and treatments out to everybody, right? And and it's funny because the CDC is absolutely world-class. That is the organization that every other country in the world looks to.
Yeah.
And it is absolutely the best in the world. And not only are we just squandering it by not pairing it with an effective public health system, but we've spent 3 years now during COVID actively undermining the CDC.
Yeah. That's
I'll stop
spoken.
ranting. Yeah.
No. There's a lot to say about that, but I wanted to talk about some positive health news, and Kevin's got coming your way, because if you're listening to this podcast, you can double bonus. You're improving your brain in more ways than one. Kevin is talking about walking and rolling. Actually had a piece about this in the South Seattle Emerald. It's our podcast gem of the week. Kevin, you wrote recently in the South Seattle Emerald about how walking or rolling for people in wheelchairs can affect our mental productivity. We've always heard go for a walk, clear up your head, and now it sounds like there's some research to really back that up.
Yeah, so researchers did some sort of standard tests they do on creative thinking with a bunch of people that were sitting and a bunch of people they're walking on a treadmill, and found out that for creative thinking, walking improved it dramatically, actually. In fact, people's ability to do creative thinking. And then they separately said, well, how do we compare people who are inside with people who are either walking or being wheeled in a wheelchair, which is effectively sitting outside? And they found being outside, walking through kind of a natural environment, also significantly improves creativity. Now, these aren't like, entirely additive to each other. So if you're taking a walk out in the woods, that's the best. It's a little better than either walking a treadmill or being wheeled outside, but both of those are way, way better than just sitting inside. So it turns out, going for a walk or just going outside for a little bit really helps creative thinking. It doesn't help every kind of thinking. There's other, what they call convergent thinking, might be around, figuring out the right answer to something. That isn't really helped by walking, but there's certain kinds of creative work that we need to do, where when somebody tells you, hey, just go for a walk for a bit. Yeah, you should actually do that, because it turns out it really does help.
That's great. And Kevin, I just need to wrap up. Maybe the Seahawks need to go for a team walk out there, because I don't know what's going on. It was such good mojo in the middle part of the season with 4 wins in a row, and then they lose 2. Do they need to go for a team walk? What's your prescription on this one, Doctor?
From what I heard, it was the defensive line that really kind of fell through this time. And I don't know if creative thinking is really a defensive line kind of skill, or one that's, maybe I'm wrong. I'm not the biggest football fan. I'm much more of a baseball guy, but
that's all right. We got some hot stove league chatter to get your way soon here, Kevin.
next
So thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah, right. Sounds good. Sounds good. And never a time to panic. Seahawks fans, make sure you're clear on that one. And thank you, Kevin, as always, I should say, for joining me here, Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on all the major platforms. And please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon to show your support for independent journalism. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.